Hello, and welcome to your early release day training on the FBA process. First, let's talk about what an FBA is. A functional behavioral assessment is a result oriented process that explicitly identifies problem behaviors, the specific actions that reliably predict occurrences and non occurrences of problem behaviors, resulting in a summary statement that offers an operational definition of the problem behavior, describes the antecedents and maintaining consequences related to the problem behavior, and states where the behavior is more or less likely to occur. That is a big, long definition, and we are going to get into the nitty gritty, the details of what an FBA is and when we do it. So, when do we do it? When are we going to complete that FBA? When a challenging behavior impedes a student's learning opportunities and the perceived function of that behavior has not been identified. So, if you find yourself saying that a behavior is random and it just seems to come out of nowhere and we don't know what's causing this behavior, we don't know what the antecedents are. Okay, sounds like you need an FBA. That is when an FBA would come into play. Today, we're going to talk about the step by steps, everything you need to complete an FBA, including the ECATs or the reevaluation process, the actual formal process of an FBA, and then all the components that you need once you open that student up for the FBA. One of the best resources that you can possibly have here in CMS is going to be that ECPPI page. You are going to find the steps for the FBA in the ECPPI Chapter 11, and we're going to go into that a little bit too into our presentation. Here are the steps for the FBA. You're going to start by opening the reevaluation for an FBA in ECATS, including observations. The next couple of steps, they can be done in different orders, but most importantly, the first thing that you want to do is open that reevaluation process. After you've opened the reeval, you're going to do the functional assessments checklist or the facts. You're going to do the ABC recording form. You're going to do the FBA wraparound questionnaire. You're going to do the summary of behavior form. That's what you're going to complete after you've done all of these things. And you're also going to complete the forced choice menu with pictures or the forced choice menu for older students. And we'll go into each and every one of these documents in this presentation today. When you're finished with all of these steps, you are then going to close the reevaluation for the FBA in ECATS and move on into creating your BIP, your behavior intervention plan. All right, let's get started. So the very first thing that you're going to do is open a reevaluation for an FBA in ECAPS.
Used to develop a behavioral intervention.
If a child with an IEP has behaviors that are interfering with their learning or the learning of others, the school should conduct a functional behavioral assessment, or FBA. An FBA is an assessment performed to determine the underlying cause of the challenging behavior.
An FBA must be based on data, and the conclusions of the FBA are used to develop a behavioral intervention plan, or BIP. The FBA conclusion will be a hypothesis statement in the format of when X occurs, the student does Y in order to Z. For example, when work is too difficult, the student runs out of the classroom in order to escape completing the assignment.
This hypothesis statement is then used to create a BIP. A BIP is a written plan that is part of the IEP that includes supports, tools, and skills for the child and school staff, positive behaviors the child can learn to replace negative behaviors, rewards for replacing behavior, and a system for tracking behavior data. A BIP should be positive and focused on giving the child the skills they need to interact successfully in school and should not be used as punishment.
Behaviors that interfere with learning might include disrupting class, skipping a particular class, or chronic absences from school, not paying attention, work refusal, disrespectful language, running out of class or the school building, also known as eloping, or even more challenging behaviors like aggression and property destruction. These are behaviors that often result in exclusion from school through in and out of school suspension, early sin homes, or restrictive IEP placements like homebound and modified day. But they do not have to result in school exclusion in order to be behaviors that interfere with learning. Work refusal is a common behavior that may not result in school exclusion, but may significantly interfere with the child's learning and therefore should be addressed through behavior goals or a BIP.
Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, if there is an MDR and the behavior leading to suspension is determined to be related to the child's disability, the school must conduct an FBA and develop a BIP, unless the student already has a BIP. Best practice is for the school to conduct an FBA and develop a BIP as soon as the IEP team identifies that there are challenging behaviors instead of waiting until the child has already accumulated 11 days of out of school suspension. But after a positive MDR is the only time it is procedurally required. You can ask that the school conduct the FBA at any time, as well as review and revise the student's BIP. You do not have to wait until your child has been suspended.
All right, so let's get into the specifics on how to open that student up for reevaluation so that we can request the FBA. The first thing that you're going to do is go to EC Process and select the invitation documents. When you create an invitation for this meeting, you are going to want to make sure that you give at least 7 days notice, as we always would. But you are also going to select that very first box, discuss the special education referral for initial evaluations or reevaluation. That is going to allow the team to propose to request a formal FBA and observations. Next, you're going to open the reevaluation to request a functional behavior assessment. You're going to select EC process, reevaluation, and then you're going to go through that reevaluation process. When you ask for formal evaluations, you're going to select the functional behavior assessment checkbox and then also observations. How do you access the reference sheet for the reevaluation process? So, in order to access that reference sheet, you are going to go to my.cms.k12.nc.us and select departments. Select exceptional children. You'll find that under the E to H. And then on the left-hand side, you're going to see in related links the EC policies, procedures, and information. This is that ECPPI that you keep hearing me reference. ECPPI would be a great thing for you to star in your bookmarks because it is something that you will find yourself going back to over and over again. Almost every question that you could possibly have is going to be answered in ECPPI. So, in order to see that reevaluation process, you're going to go to ECPPI and you're going to select number 6. That's going to be the reevaluation process chapter. Here you're going to see a reference sheet for the reevaluation process. So, this is for that reevaluation determination meeting, the reevaluation report. You're going to go to the invitations document in EC process menu. So this is what we just discussed. Give them at least 7 days notice. Then you're going to go to the reevaluation EC process under ECATS. And then the IEP team is going to meet to complete the reevaluation report. So you are going to complete all of these little boxes. Make sure you have those green check marks next to them. And when you say reevaluation decision, you're going to ask for formal assessments. All right, and this just takes you to the process for reevaluation. So you're going to begin with the assessment summary, make sure that you're adding all of the assessments if they're not already in place. This is a great time to review the assessment list and just make sure that everything for the student is in there. And there's an easier option if you want to add a bunch at once. You can go to add multiple assessments at the bottom of the page, and you can enter the assessments here that way. So if you're opening the student up for an FBA, chances are, not always, but chances are you are looking at a student who you're already serving as an exceptional child, and they probably already have an IEP. So you're going to see assessments already in place in here. But just in case you don't, you can use that reference sheet for reevaluation and go through this process. You are going to select the IEP team has decided that formal evaluations are needed to determine. And the reason you're doing that is because the FBA is a formal evaluation. So the team should review at minimum all evaluations on the last completed eligibility worksheet. So what we're talking about here, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on this, is this would be if a student is not currently up for eligibility review, right? So we know every 3 years, or hopefully you know, if you don't know, you're about to find out. Every 3 years, a student has to go under reevaluation to either ask for new formal evaluations or not to determine continuing eligibility for special education and related services in North Carolina. So if your student happens to be due for reevaluation, and you are also opening them for an FBA, you can do these two things concurrently. You do not have to only do this outside of that reevaluation process. So there may be circumstances where you are opening your student up, they're coming up on their 3-year due, and you may be asking for no other formal evaluations. You might be doing a record review, or let's say you need a new educational. There are a million different instances, scenarios that you can create for your student that would serve your individual student. But just know that if you're asking for an FBA, you are always going to select the IEP team has decided that formal evaluations are needed. And that is because the FBA is a formal evaluation. All right, so this is really important. I want to explain the difference between an eligibility determination or a programming change. So if formal evaluations are needed, a series of questions are going to display pertaining to whether the evaluations are needed for eligibility or programming. And that would just be programming like the development of an IEP. The evaluation plan section will display where the team will select the assessments needed. So that's when we're going to select the FBA, but I'll show you that on the next page. If the team answers yes to one or more of the questions in the eligibility section, that means that the team will be reconvening at a later time to review the results of the evaluation and determine eligibility. And that will reset the student's 3-year reevaluation date. So just like I was saying before, let's say you have a student who's due for their 3-year reevaluation review, and you are asking for, just an example, a new educational and this FBA. When you meet again at the eligibility determination meeting, you are going to be determining eligibility. That means that you're going to be creating a new worksheet. They are due for an eligibility determination, so you will be doing that. Let's say that your student just had an eligibility determination last year, so they don't need to be considered for eligibility. They are already considered eligible. They're not due for a while. Okay, perfect. In that case, you would just be making a programming change. So yes, you would be asking for this FBA because you need the FBA in order to create the BIP, right? You need the FBA to determine the functions of the behavior, the maladaptive behavior. But you are not necessarily determining eligibility in that circumstance. So in that circumstance, it would just be a programming change. Here's what it looks like, and I'm sure you've seen this before. If you are making an eligibility determination when you're opening the student for reevaluation, you would want to say yes to one or more of these yes or no questions, right? But if we're just doing a programming change, ergo the FBA in itself, just an FBA, it's just a programming change. It does not need an eligibility determination. So, in that circumstance, you would say yes to creating present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So, the idea is that when you're done with this FBA, you're going to have a lot of formal data that is going to help you create present levels, goals, and objectives for your student when it pertains to behavior. Yes, whether any additional modifications to special education or related services are needed at this time. So the programming change, you might be looking for additional time in social emotional learning. You might be looking for additional supports, like I said, in behavior. Those sorts of things would be a programming change that you would see modifications to special education or related services. When you get to the screening and evaluations, if you are simply asking for that FBA, you are going to select functional behavioral assessment, and then you're also going to select observations. Then you are going to create the draft and finalize your reevaluation report. And you're going to enter all that information, the meeting date, the meeting participants, just like you would. And then you are going to select the procedural safeguards at the bottom. Make sure that your parent is always given a copy of their parent rights and responsibilities. And then make sure that a copy of the reevaluation report, eligibility report, and prior written notice will be provided to the parent and student, and or student. You just want to make sure that those procedural safeguards are in place, that you are doing those things. Next, you are going to create consent. So if you have asked for an FBA and observations, you're going to create consent to evaluate. To do that, you go to create consent to evaluate in the consent tab of the EC process menu. You're going to obtain the parent's consent at the meeting if they've attended. If the parent did not attend the meeting or attended the meeting by phone, send the consent home immediately to obtain permission to evaluate. If the parent does not consign the consent before developing a prior written notice, document one of the following statements on the prior written notice. So let me say that one more time. If you get that consent signed before you finish that prior written notice, cool beans, you're good. If you have not, you want to say previous signed consent to evaluate on file. So that would be your written consent to conduct evaluations through the reevaluation process is being requested. Please return this consent date 10 calendar days out past the meeting. If we do not receive written consent by that date, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act allows the school district to proceed with conducting evaluations if your consent is not received and they have reasonable measures taken to obtain your consent. So you want to date that out for 10 days in the prior written notice, but we also note that if we do not receive consent, we can go ahead and evaluate if we feel like we've given reasonable measures to obtain that consent. No previous signed consent to evaluate on file. So that prior circumstance is only if we have on file in the past permission to evaluate. So if we have consent in the past. If we do not have consent, you would write your written consent to conduct evaluations through the reevaluation process is being requested. Please return this consent by and date that 10 calendar dates out from the meeting. Just note that when calculating those 10 days after the meeting, do not count the days in which the district is on winter break or spring break. Also, I don't count weekends. I don't know about you, but don't count those weekends. Just do school days, 10 days after the meeting date, school days. All right, and here is a visual for you on how to request that consent. So you just, like I said, EC process tab, consent. It's for reeval. You're going to go ahead and create that draft. And then once they have sent it back, signed it and sent it back, you are going to document when they did that. So you go back into consent, go back down to 3, say what it's for, reeval. This will actually autofill after you've already created the consent to evaluate that they sign. And then you're just going to note the date that it was signed and whether they said yes or no. Okay, so remember I was telling you chapter 11 in ECPPI, we discussed that earlier. So here we are. We have opened the student up for reevaluation, we have consent to evaluate, and we are ready to go. And we have that consent signed and returned. So we're ready to go. We're ready to go into our chapter 11 here, and you're going to go to your scroll down and you're going to go to the little drop down box that says Functional Behavior Assessment, FBA.
The FBA should consist of the following steps. Step 1. The IEP team must identify and define the specific problem behavior in observable, measurable terms. Then the IEP team determines what information will be collected, who will collect each piece of information, and how. Collecting information does not mean writing down stories from teachers, staff, or parents about the child's behavior while in an IEP meeting. It is a longer process that should happen outside of the IEP meeting.
Step 2. Collect information on the specific problem behavior through observations across school settings, record reviews, and systematic data collection that includes when and where the behavior occurred, who was present, how often and for how long it occurred, what happened just before the behavior started, what happened after the behavior stopped, and what were the consequences. Consequences include the immediate reactions of staff and other students, not just behavior consequences. It is best if the information collection includes observations from a staff member who does not know the child. The collection of information should also include interviews of the child, parents, and staff about the behavior and about the child's strengths and needs.
Okay, so here we go. We have our consent. We're ready to do this FBA. So something you want to start with is that forced choice menu. These are utilized to determine classroom reinforcers that will motivate the student and are based on their interests. So let's take a look at these. Let's look at the one with pictures first. So if we take a look in here, you're going to see this document, and this is going to be linked under that chapter 11 for you. And it's also going to be in this presentation. All right, so here are some examples. Now keep in mind, this is an example. You can create one for your student based on your suspicions. You know your student, you should know your student. You can get input from the parent. This might not be applicable to your student. Your student might hate high fives and they might hate being a line leader. They might hate toys. Like they might like stars and they might like um Paw Patrol. You are trying to create a choice based system for your student. If you know that they love counters or they love soft toys, they love lights, they love flashlights, they love vacuums, they love fans, like I'm just listing random things, but it's not random, right? Because our kids are very unique and it takes a long time to get to know our kids. Yes, the forced choice is important for us to get to know kids that we may not know, but don't shoot yourself in the foot, essentially. Don't give your kids some things that you've never seen them show interest, like sitting with friends and reading a book to yourself. If you know that your student does not attend to paper books and you know that they do not like to sit with friends, like you're just going to end up with no information at the end of this if you don't give yourself a hand, right? So get some input from their parents, get some input from maybe other teachers in the school, staff members who know them. Say, what have you noticed that they like? And then you want to verify those suspicions with the student. That's when the forced choice comes into play, right? So if mom says, that this student loves to jump rope and they also love to play with their sister and brother. You might say, now we can't give them play with sister and brother at school, right? But we can say, would you rather jump rope or would you rather play with a friend? And then we can get their choice based on that. And just create yourself a choice board that really serves your student and gives you information. Now, if you don't have any information on the kid, okay, that's fine. Give them this exact forced choice board. That is totally an option too. Give it to them just as is, and then you will be able to score it. Um, you'll be able to score it based on these things. But go ahead and give them this one no matter what, right? Because it's going to have a baseline, but I'm just advising you that if you get to the end of this and it came off 0, like it just came off they would not choose, they didn't want either of these, give yourself some grace of maybe adapting it to your student and things that you know that they may like. But absolutely create this, finish this, have this on file. That was an attempt. This one is a forced choice menu for older students. So this one does not have those pictures. And it says older students. It doesn't necessarily mean older students. We teach students who have different varying levels of ability. And just because you're older does not necessarily mean that that forced choice board with pictures was not more developmentally appropriate for you. So even though this says for older students, know that this is really more for students who um, do not need those picture supports or that simplified content. But there's no age limit to give the forced choice with pictures. All right, next we're going to talk about this ABC recording form. So let's go ahead and open this up so that we can take a look. When you open this document from Chapter 11 on ECPPI, it's going to force you to make a copy. This sheet should be somewhat familiar to you. It looks just like a regular ABC form, if this is the type of sheet that you use when you're recording your ABC data. This one's a little bit different though, because you're going to see on the top in bright yellow, it says a minimum of 2 observations lasting at least 20 minutes per observation must be conducted. And it is a minimum of at least 20 minutes. So if you observe longer, that is totally fine. I have done these observations where I've been there for a full 3 to 4 hours. It really just depends on what type of observation you're looking for. It depends on if you saw what you needed in 20 minutes. You don't always see what you need in 20 minutes. So it really just depends on the amount of time, what you're looking for. These are very personalized. So go in, see what you need to see, and get all the data that you can, because seeing the behavior is extremely important in order for us to make these true ABC recording forms effective. So make sure that you're observing at least twice. Now, like I mentioned before, this entire process is going to be really heavily supported by your school psychologist. School psychologists may completely lead the charge on this, but it's important for us to know the steps as well. So you may find that the school psychologist will do one of these, maybe a school administrator, your ECCT, possibly people at the school-based level may do these observations. But it really could be anybody within the building who is kind of a third party, can really observe the student in what I don't recommend. What I don't recommend is necessarily the teacher doing it, because if you were able to make these observations, then you probably wouldn't be in this situation where you're doing the FBA, right? Because if you could sit objectively and just have the time to look and just watch the student, you might be able to find the functions of these behaviors. But typically, it takes an outside set of eyes to really look and get that antecedent, right? Really see, okay, what is the trigger for this behavior? And how consistent is this trigger occurring? And what do we see the outcomes or the consequences of these are? So it's important to understand how to complete an ABC data tracker in order to use this recording form. But you just fill this out exactly as it says: student name, grade, date, the name of the observer, the time that they observed. I always like to put for how long up here too. So I might say like 10, 20, 2 hours, 10, 30, 20 minutes. It just depends on what you do. And then they're going to want to record exactly how they see it, right? And you're going to really get some wonderful information from this. I have experienced 100%. I have experienced teachers in the past say, there's no consistency. I don't know why he's doing what he's doing. It's random. And then when we get done with this FBA process and they look at these ABC recording forms, they say, oh my gosh, it only happens in small group. It only happens during unstructured times. Like they start to see those trends. Like there truly are antecedents. There are location-based or activity-based triggers. And a lot of times there is an outcome that is consistently happening that's reinforcing those behaviors. For example, if every time the student throws a chair, he gets adult attention, you may not be able to avoid that adult attention because it's a safety concern, but it may help us realize, oh, this is attention seeking. They're consistently getting attention. It increases the faster we respond. These are sorts of things that you really get from an FBA. An FBA is an extremely detailed process during which you can uncover all of these different things, these different pieces of information. So that's at ABC recording form. Like I said, you want to have at least 2 observations on that recording form for at least 20 minutes per observation. Next is the fact sheet. And like I said, these things are not necessarily completed in order, right? Like you can go ahead and have that fact sheet in process. I like to share this fact sheet well, as a person who's doing usually the interviews, I like to start this as soon as possible because it can take a little bit longer. But essentially what this does is it's a method for identifying factors that predict and maintain those maladaptive behaviors. So, what, when, where, and why, right? It's going to identify the triggers and antecedents, those immediate triggers and antecedents, but also setting events, things that just happen to be occurring, right? Small group, whole group, maybe a bell going off for a change in classes, possibly coming into school later because they missed the bus. Like these are setting specifics or setting events that we can start to see trends revolving around. Outcomes that reinforce the behaviors or consequences. So, do they gain something from it? Do they avoid something from it? What is it? Predictability? Is it power, control of a situation, or is it sensory or compulsive, impulsatory behavior? And then skill deficits. What are the replacement behaviors that we need to teach in order to see a replacement behavior possible, right? Because we can't just say the student needs to be making better choices. What does that look like? What are these better choices that we speak of, right? We can't just say that a student needs to have calm hands and a calm body without giving them the social stories or the modeling that they need in order to understand what those replacement behaviors are. So the facts is really going to be an all-encompassing document. So let's take a look at it. You're going to open it in chapter 11 and it's going to force you to make a copy. And once you do so, it's going to bring you to this document here. And you're going to see that it's about 6 pages long and it's going to get a lot of information from you. So it starts off with routines analysis. So the where, when, with whom the problem behavior is most likely to occur. So this is just a data tracker, right? We'll say when, like the time, we'll say the routine that's happening or the staff involved, the likelihood that the problem behavior is going to occur, the specific problem behavior, and the current interventions for that problem behavior. So let me just give you an example of how this may look. It might be that at 8:30 every morning, the student comes into class from the bus. And let me start a little bit further back. At 8:30 every morning, the student exits the bus and they seek out their preferred adult, who is the assistant principal. So the staff involved would be the assistant principal, and the routine would be getting off of the bus. And let's say that we notice in a 5-day week that this usually happens about 3 times per week, right? So I would say that that's between like a 4 and a 5 likelihood. It just depends. You're going to be taking data, right? So let's say that you have 12 data points and it happens 8 times. That would be like a 4 out of 6 on the likelihood. So you're going to want to make sure that you have multiple data points to support this as a problem behavior. If Johnny got off the bus and spit at another peer once, that's not enough to create a data point. That's not a problem behavior. It's not a cool thing to do, but it's not a problem behavior that we're going to use an FBA to solve, right? So this has to be a recurring behavior. So just as an example, at 8:30 every day, Johnny gets off the bus, he disembarks the bus, he heads to the cafeteria, and he finds his favorite staff member, the assistant principal. And the likelihood of a behavior occurring at this time, let's just say, is a 4 based on the data. And the specific behavior is that he spits at a peer. So that's something that's occurring like very consistently, right? At 4 out of 12 or 4 out of 6 opportunities, this student's getting off the bus, going to his preferred adult, and he is spitting at a peer, right? That's pretty consistent. Now, if it was happening like 2 out of 6 times, okay, that's like a low incidence, like low likelihood. It's still happening and it's not cool, but it's not happening as frequently, right? Now, if Johnny is getting off the bus every single day without fail, going to his preferred adult and spitting on a peer like immediately as he touches her hand, that's a 6, right? It's going to happen. At this point, we've taken enough data to say it is within extremely high likelihood that this is going to happen. And then we talk about the current interventions for the problem, right? Current interventions might be a redirection. Current interventions might be a visual support that says no spitting. Current I don't know, it might be to give him a preferred object instead, right? Like a book, like a distractor. It might be to give him a distractor before he goes into the building because we know he's going to spit on a student. And maybe if we give him that book ahead of time, it decreases the likelihood that he's going to spit on a peer, right? Okay, so those would be examples of current interventions for the problem. Are they always effective? Maybe not, but they're the interventions that we're using. It might be as simple as a social story when he gets to class. And if he's still doing it in 6 opportunities out of 6 opportunities, it's a highly likelihood thing, then where you can probably say that that intervention is not effective and we need to move on to a different intervention. This is just putting everything out on the table, right? So that we can start making those informed decisions. So what you're going to want to do is this should be an interview process. This is typically done by the psychologist. So you may, as a teacher, find yourself in a situation where the psychologist is interviewing you for this information. And you'll be giving times that these behaviors typically occur, what the routine looks like, what's happening, what staff are involved, and you might start to see trends, right? We might see that every single time that the assistant principal comes to support this student, he spits on a peer. There's a lot of reasons that could be happening, right? Yeah, it doesn't mean that this adult is not preferred and loved, but they can still be a trigger. Like, and we are educators, we've seen this before, right? Somebody can be a trigger whether they are loved or not. A parent can be a trigger. Every time a parent comes to pick up this student, he kicks me in the shins and runs to the parent. The behavior is kicking me in the shins and running away. The trigger is the parent showing up. So that's when you have to start adjusting things in the circumstance and the situation to try and intervene against the behavior of kicking me in the shin, right? And you might try a million different things, and the end result might be I need to wear knee pads or I need to wear shin guards when I drop this student off with his parent. But we're going to try everything we can to get as little scaffolding as possible in order to support the student and give them maximum independence. So that is really why we do the routine analysis at the top so that we can start finding trends. The targeted routine. So you're going to select the highest rating. So let's say that the absolute highest rating occurs during bus times when he's getting off the bus and getting off the bus. You did that routine analysis and you found those things. Maybe it's during transitions. Maybe it's during lunchtime. Maybe it's during downtime. You're going to start using that list to find the routine that has the highest rating. Only combine routines when there is significant similarities. So, for example, like I said, the bus, it could be getting on and off the bus, right? Or it could be transitions to and from or I would say like not to and from the lunchroom, because that truly is something really different. Maybe it's transitions from a food related task to a non food related task. So, from breakfast to morning meeting, from snack to recess, from specials to lunch, and we see an increase in behavior whenever we are going away from food to something else. That's significant, something to know, right? But you really want to be focusing on one routine and the activities and the conditions and the problem behaviors, right? So you're going to note that on here. Next, the ABC tracker. So this is the teacher data. Focus on a single routine. So you're going to see part A, the part we just talked about, to identify and prioritize a routine and track occurrences of the problem behavior during the prioritized routine. So the subject or time of day, let's just say morning meeting. Let's use that as an example. Morning meetings are time. We're seeing these behaviors in morning meeting. It's really, really high chance of it occurring. Each time a problem behavior occurs during this routine over the next week, document it on the ABC sequence. So use the data collection to identify patterns or trends across occurrences to form a summary statement describing the student's behavior. So here's our example. So let's say February 8th at 9:45. That would be our date and our time. And you would say the when, so the antecedent. So when the student is asked to complete a worksheet, multi-digit multiplication and word problems independently, the student, and this is the behavior, verbally refuses to work and says this is stupid, wanders around the room and makes negative comments like you're dumb. As a result or a consequence, the teacher will leave the student alone and the student does not have to do the worksheet. All right, so that is just an example of a simple ABC teacher data tracker that would be specific to this occurrence. So, like, let's say that we are really looking specifically at that morning meeting. Like it's a 6, it's happening every single time. Every time we start morning meeting, we transition to morning meeting, this student spits at students, right? It could happen for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. He might spit the whole morning meeting. So that's a time that we're really focusing on. So you want to get as many incidences as possible here. You're talking about, like, let's say morning meeting on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Get yourself a bunch of data points here so that you can really start making that correlation or use the data to find patterns, right? And then the summary statement. So you should be able to make a statement based off of what you account above, right? So when antecedent happens. The student does this behavior, and as a result, this consequence occurs. Therefore, the function of the behavior is to blankety blank. Let's say when the student transitions to morning meeting, the student spits and throws chairs at his peers. As a result, the teacher ignores the student and does not require him to sit at morning meeting. Therefore, the function of this behavior is task avoidance, morning meeting avoidance. Ta-da! There you go. The next section is going to be those student strengths. So this is just going to be development of the case. So find those student strengths, give us those academic strengths, social recreational strengths or other. Then you're going to talk about some behaviors. So rank the top priority problem behaviors that are occurring during the targeted routine. So if we're using that morning meeting example, it might be, let's see. I would say maybe fight physical aggression. Not really. Well, and he's throwing the chair. So fight physical aggression, disruption for sure. And I would say other and mention the spitting. Describe targeted behaviors in observable terms. I would just put exactly what you said. When we transition to morning meeting, or don't even say that because that's not the behavior, right? You could say spitting at peers, throwing chairs. If it's not just at peers and adults, I would say spitting at peers, spitting at adults, throwing chairs at peers, throwing chairs at adults. What's the frequency of the problem behavior in the targeted routine? So let's say morning meeting is 30 minutes a day. You can put that in there. So 5 days per week, 30 minutes per session. What's the duration of the problem or the targeted routine? Or what's the duration of the problem behavior in the targeted routine? So the frequency, I'm sorry, would be the number of times the problem behavior is occurring. So let's say that typically he'll spit 8 times during morning meeting, right? So he spits 8 times during morning meeting, and morning meeting is 30 minutes once per day. There we go. What's the duration of the problem? I would say 1 second, right? What's a spit? A spit is a second. So if he spits and then just like stops spitting, that one's kind of finite, right? You can only spit for so long. Now, if he's just like, I mean, like I just did a raspberry on this training, but if he's just like spitting and spitting and spitting and not stopping, maybe you could get a little longer of a duration on that, right? Does the student's behavior pose imminent danger to self or others? For spitting, I would say no. Spitting is annoying, spitting is gross, but spitting does not cause imminent danger. Now, throwing chairs, yes. Yes, it does. And then if it does cause imminent danger to self or others, that's when you have to ask yourself, okay, have we developed a crisis plan? If a student is throwing chairs every single morning meeting, chances are it is time, if not already past due, for that crisis plan. The crisis plan is something that we discussed in the previous training. If you need more support on that crisis plan, make sure you go back to that training. It is definitely important to know how to do a crisis plan, and that crisis plan is going to be essential to ensure student safety. All right, coming to the end of the fact sheet, that functional assessment checklist for teachers and staff facts part 2. This is part B. You're going to start talking about specifying the targeted routine. So you're going to use the targeted routine from the facts part A that we just did or just talked about. So you're going to start by saying the routine activities or context next to the staff member's name, and then the problem behavior. So make that description observable, right? So you're going to put that information in both of these sections, and you're going to use the information from part A. The next section is going to be those antecedents and triggers. So you're going to rank the strongest triggers or predictors of a problem behavior in the targeted routine, and then ask corresponding follow-up questions to get more detailed understanding of those triggers that are mentioned in 1 and 2. So let's say that we decide for this hypothetical student that it is maybe large group instruction. So he's going from his breakfast time to large group instruction. It could be transition. It could be, let's see, what else might it be? I might say other if it's only happening during morning meeting, right? It's more of a structured time. So it would rank in order your strongest twos. So I would say in this situation, it would be large group instruction and transition. That really seems like two things that I notice are immediate um, environmental features, right? And then you're going to ask the following questions. So if A, B, C, D, or E, describe the task or demand in detail. So if it's A, B, C, D, or E, it was none of those, so we're not going to do that. If it's F, describe the purpose or correction, voice, tone, or volume. It wasn't F. If it's G, H, I, J, or K, describe the setting, activity, content, in detail. So because we did select from those, you're going to describe its morning meeting. It's going from breakfast, which is one-to-one time, working on IEP goals, to a large group instruction. It's also a transition from that time. The activity is going to be to morning meeting. It starts out with music. Give it some detail. And then the next section is going to be the consequence. So rank order the strongest payoff for student that appears most likely to maintain the problem behavior in a targeted routine. Then ask follow-up questions to detail the consequences ranked 1 and 2. So consequence and function for this specific example, I would say that it is probably task avoidance. So avoid undesired task or activity, and possibly adult attention. So maybe one of those two. Those are my suspicions. If you said A or B, or I'm sorry, if A or B, whose attention is obtained, how is the positive or negative attention provided? It might be every time that he does this behavior, he immediately gets the attention of the teacher. And it could be a redirection from the teacher. And that is a it's positive attention, but it's still attention provided. And if this is an attention seeking behavior, that might be exactly what he's looking for. But if we're talking about that task avoidance, then you're going to describe the specific task, activity, sensory input. Be specific. Do not simply list the subject area, but specifically describe the type of work within that subject area. So you're going to be very specific on that for your student in this morning meeting hypothetical. And then it's going to ask you for those setting events. So rank order any events that happen outside the targeted routine. So at home or earlier in the day that commonly make problem behaviors more likely or worsen in targeted routine. So let's say consistently across the board that this student is coming to school late, right? Coming to school late. Let's just say that. So school starts at 7:30, they're coming at 8:15. They're only having 15 minutes to finish their breakfast, and then we're going straight into morning meeting, right? So we're seeing that coming to school late is like a consistent setting, event specific. And then you're going to summarize those behaviors. So, based on everything that you just listed, this whole big long fact sheet, you are going to list that targeted routine, put in the antecedent that's most common, those setting events, the problem behavior, and the consequence or the function of the behavior. And then you're going to go ahead and list here how or rank how likely it is to occur. So 6 being like almost 100%. It's gonna happen, no doubt. And then 1 being not real sure. So I mean, gosh, I hope it's not a 1 or else you just filled out that whole fax for nothing, right? Chances are that if you are going through this whole process, that you're looking at a behavior that's pretty likely to occur, right? So you're probably going to see something that's in that 3, 4, 5, or 6 range. All right. I know that's a really long sheet. I know that it's a lot of information, but you can see how the information in that fact sheet is going to be a huge indicator on the results of this FBA. Next, we are going to talk about the FBA wraparound questionnaire. This will be completed with input from all stakeholders. So we're getting input from the teacher, from parent, from nurses, the student, if they're able to provide that input, a record review. This is going to be a whole child approach to gather information for the team to review. It can be medical, strengths, academics, functional abilities, their adaptive behavior scores, their cognitive scores. Like, this is a record review. It's going to be a big long document. No surprise here. Same thing. You open it up, it has you make a copy. And here is that wraparound questionnaire. This is going to end up being very long. I have seen wraparound questionnaires that once they're filled out, they're as long as 12 pages. So this is going to take you a minute to fill out. Send this to all the stakeholders. Send this to anybody who can contribute information here. Typically, the charge is going to be led by that school psychologist to be the interviewer here, but the interviewees can be a litany of people. All stakeholders should be consulted when you are filling out this document. Now, this document is very self-explanatory. It is a tried and true record review. You're really going to have to know the student to be able to fill out this document. On the section down here where it says student interview, we may have students who you are not necessarily able to interview. You want to be able to make sure that you are getting input from all of the stakeholders, but also giving the student the opportunity to answer these themselves. So whether it's partner assisted scanning, yes, no questions, do your best to make sure that you can get as much student input as possible. If they're only able to use a field of 3 visual choices, give them 3 visual choices that you may have narrowed for their strengths, for their interests, for something they might like to do in their spare time. Ask the parent, what are 3 things they like to do in their spare time? And then give the student those 3 choices. Do you like to read books, paint, or do Play-Doh in your free time? And they might pick their favorite one, or you might go through each one. Do you like to paint in your free time? Yes or no? Do you like to do Play-Doh in your free time? Yes or no? Like, make this an opportunity to learn more information about the student, but you're going to want to complete that forced choice reinforcement survey in order to help you fill out this information. Next is the summary of behavior form. Okay, this is the big one. This one has to be done after you've completed all of the other forms. So we've done the facts, we have done, you really want to make sure you finish everything. You need that wraparound done, you need the facts, you're going to need that ABC form completed from those observations that are no less than 2 observations, 20 minutes apiece. Using all that information, you are going to complete the summary of behavior form. All right, it's a long form, but it's going to tell you exactly where you need each of these pieces of information from, right? So step 1 is that wraparound questionnaire review. You are going to indicate this information using the wraparound questionnaire. The next section, step 2, you are going to use the, sorry, hiccup. In each row, you are going to fill in the summary statement for the identified FBA tool. So for step 2, you're going to see it tells you each tool to use. So the FBA interview with teachers and staff, that's going to be facts. You're going to pull this information from an event in the facts. The next section is that first observation, the formal observation 1 from the ABC recording form. You're going to indicate that information based on that first observation. The next one's going to be pulled from the second observation from the ABC recording form. Indicate that information there. On the ABC tracker summary, you're going to indicate that information here. So each of those documents that you filled out, you are going to pull one of those routines and indicate that information that was collected in that form on this form. The next section's optional. So you can do the other assessments section here at the bottom, and this would just be outside evaluations or a historical FBA if they've had one in the past, and you would indicate that information here. Step 2 would be review results across the FBA tools and develop a final FBA summary. So based on everything that is listed above, which is based on every document that you have created during this FBA process, you're going to come up with the final FBA summary of behavior. One routine, one setting event, a when, a will, and a result, a consequence. And using that, that is going to be pretty much the summary of your FBA, right? All this data, everything that we've done, this whole process has led up to us to be able to say that based on our formal observations, our formal FBA process, we have determined that during this routine, given these setting event specifics, when this happens, this antecedent, student will do this in order to obtain attention, a tangible item, sensory input, escape or avoidance. And how confident are we in the accuracy of our FBA? Not really sure or highly confident. All right, it's a lot. It's a lot of information, but you can do a sigh of relief because if you've reached this point in the FBA process, you've done the FBA. Congratulations. It's a huge undertaking, but doing an FBA and completing an FBA should, if done correctly, should completely open up your world. If you start the FBA process asking why, how, I don't know, and you're human and you're an educator and you want the best for your kid and you may not know. At the end of the FBA process, if it is done correctly with fidelity, you will have answers. They might not be the answers you want or the answers that are that exciting to get, but they're going to be answers. And at the end of it, you are going to have the answers that you need to write your behavior intervention plan.
3. Once all the information is collected, the IEP team needs to review and analyze the data. Then the team creates a hypothesis statement, which should use this format. When X occurs, the student does Y in order to Z. The hypothesis statement should be as specific as possible. Another example of a good hypothesis statement would be when Mary's asked to work independently in class on a math assignment, she throws her book in order to get sent to in-school suspension so she can avoid revealing to her peers that she cannot independently do the assignment. If the hypothesis statement reveals that the student may need additional or different special education services, the IEP team should ensure that the student gets those services. Then the IEP team uses the hypothesis statement to develop a behavioral intervention plan, also known as a BIP.
Okay. So you've created all this stuff. You put all the work in, you completed the FBA. What comes next, right? So you finish the formal evaluations. It is time to close this process and go ahead and do that program change that you decided that as a team you were going to use this FBA to do, right? So you're going to create an invitation. You are going to select on that invitation. Make sure you give at least 7 days notice, but select on that invitation, discuss evaluation results to determine eligibility for special education related services, discuss, develop, review, or revise the IEP and other. And you're going to say review BIP and crisis plan. When it says other, it's going to let you type that in. All right, so you're going to review that FBA, all the documentation that you went through. You do not need to do eligibility, like we said before. If you're just doing that FBA and those observations, and eligibility does not need to be redetermined, right? So you're going to review the FBA and all the results from the FBA, and you're going to go right into updating the IEP. The meeting purpose should be an initial for IEPs that are developed after initial eligibility determination or an annual review or addendum when changing some but not all components of the IEP. So in this case, let's say this is your kiddo and you just did the FBA and you're going to make some changes here. You're going to do an annual review. You're going to make sure that in the assessment summary, so enter the assessments conducted in the assessment summary. So you're going to click Add Assessments button at the bottom of the screen and add assessments from a list or add custom assessments in the second tab. You are going to want to make sure that you add your functional behavioral assessment. The thing you just did, make sure you add your FBA in the assessments page. Under special factors, you are going to go ahead and under the question that says, does the student have behaviors that impede his or her learning or that of others? You're going to say yes, based on your FBA. And then you are going to select behavior intervention plan, BIP, and then you're also going to select behavior goals. Under services, this is very important. So this section includes additional information regarding transportation, least restrictive environment, justification statement. Bless me. For preschool students, progress reports, training for school staff to address unique needs. But here's where it really matters for the FBA process that we just did. Under describe special transportation services, you're going to include any pertinent behavior information, especially for like a hypothetical where we are saying that the student's behaviors happen on the bus, right? Let's say that they are throwing their shoes, they'll throw any projectiles that they have, right? That is going to affect transportation, right? We want to describe how we can support them during transportation. So maybe they have a CSRS, maybe they have to wear soft shoes on the bus, or maybe they have to take their shoes off and put them in their backpack when they're seated on the bus. Like these are things that go ahead and put those in there. If your FBA came up with those results, it's very appropriate to put that in there. Next, in the LRE, the least restrictive environment statement, you're going to include statements about the BIP in the LRE. So make sure you mention that the student currently has a behavior intervention plan, that the IEP team meeting with stakeholders will be meeting to discuss and review every 6 to 8 weeks, whatever it may be, right? Include that in here. They have a BIP now. The BIP is to help them safely access their educational environment to their greatest potential. Like we want to make sure that we are noting they have a BIP. Describe consultation and or training for for school staff to meet the unique needs of the student. Describe special behavioral training needs. This may be an appropriate place to mention that school staff need to be within an arm's length of the student. You know, you want to make sure that they have the appropriate measures of support in order to meet the unique needs of the student. So you want to make sure that you have that in there. In the LRE, so you want to include statements about behavior in the LRE, and here's an example. So you are going to have all the other information in there. Do not take anything about the cognitive delays, social, emotional needs, physical. Leave all that in your LRE statement. This isn't just a behavioral student or a student with behavioral needs. One example might be student also had many behavioral interventions due to attention seeking and task avoidance behaviors. He or she is not only non-compliant, but at times aggressive towards students and peer or staff and peers would just be an example. I don't like to use the word violent unless it's extremely appropriate. I like to, but that's just preference. I like to say um, student focused aggression, peer focused aggression, student directed or peer directed aggression or staff directed aggression. It just depends on your preference there. And then at the end there, you see an example student will have access to his or her typically developing peers in recess, lunch, or during music class. I will say this, if your FBA showed that these peer directed or peer targeted behaviors only occur during recess without an adult present to give them additional support, say that in here. This is their LRE statement. So if they need an adult within arm's reach during recess based on the FBA, put that in here. so that you make sure that they have what they need. If it's only during art because they stick beans in their ears and they're having to go to the hospital because they keep putting beans in their ears, make sure that they have an adult present in music class. Like put that in there. Um, Adult within an arm's reach in music class, or I'm sorry, art class. There would not be beans in music class, but if there are, music class too. All right, and you want to also make sure that all of these needs are reflected in the accommodations. So include those classroom and or testing accommodations needed to support the student based on their BIP. And don't forget, please don't forget your prior written notice. I know that we didn't determine eligibility in this hypothetical meeting, but we want to make sure that we are doing a prior written notice, not just because we did an IEP, but any discussion. Let's just say in the future, if you're doing just a regular BIP review, you're going to want to make sure that you have a prior written notice to document all of these conversations. So make sure you have that prior written notice. All right. I hope that was a helpful training for you on the FBA process. I know that this is a very detailed process and it can be overwhelming. It can be very intimidating. But if you need any additional support with this, some great people to reach out to in your building are going to be your compliance facilitator, a mentor teacher, your ECCTs at your grade level, or if you're in the extensions program, your EPECCTs. But especially your school psychologists. Your school psychologists are going to know how to complete this process with fidelity. I would also recommend not engaging in this process without the understanding of all the stakeholders, right? So if you are planning on engaging in this process of opening an FBA, involve your stakeholders. Make sure that your speech pathologists, your OT, your PTs, your school psychologists, the classroom teachers that serve him are involved in this process too. And I ideally are even at that reevaluation meeting to request this formal evaluation because every single person who is involved with this student's total experience at school can have something to contribute to the FBA process. And that is how we get a complete and effective and meaningful FBA at the end of this. And an FBA is a lot of work. So it is really important to put our effort into it to make sure that it is worth the work. So, and it really is worth the work because without that FBA, it is going to be nearly impossible to create that behavior intervention plan, which is what comes next. So, for our last early release day on April 2nd, 2025, we are going to be discussing creating the BIP and the crisis plan. All this hard work with behavior interventions, identifying behaviors, using strategies. And okay, that didn't work. Let's go ahead and move to an FBA process. It leads to this BIP and the crisis plan. And we will definitely be making sure that you fully understand that process when we meet with you next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this training, and I hope it was helpful.